admittedly obsessed with all things fantasy. I mean, I literally have dragons and magic swords tattooed on my body. But as a result, I've made quite a few cloaks. Today, however, is the penultimate episode in my Bridgerton Regency-inspired sewing project, which has included such things as this Regency Spencer, and if you're interested in watching others, make sure you check out the playlist. But as the second to last episode, we're officially moving into the formal wear category, and I need another cloak. But I don't want it to just be another cloak that I've already made tons of times before. So today we're making a fancy cloak. It'll have all of those beloved elements like the long, full body and the big drapey hood, but this time with all sorts of bells and whistles attached. I'm excited. Are you excited? I hope you're excited, because this is happening anyways. If you've seen any of my previous cloak videos, you know that my cloaks are typically made from a series of trapezoids. The height of the trapezoid is about the length that you want your cloak to be, from around your collarbone to maybe around your ankle or so. The top edge is 1/6 of your shoulder plus a little bit of extra room for gathering. And the bigger you can get the bottom edge, the better for a really flowy, drapey cloak. Ideally, that's about 1/6 of your total length of fabric, minus around 18 inches or so for a hood. If you'd like to be able to make a cloak that's exactly to your measurements, my previous cloak video explains how to take those measurements, how to draft the pattern, and how to edit it based on the amount of fabric that you have. I drafted this cloak for about 5 yards of the outer layer and the lining fabrics, cutting out each of these little shorter half cloaks from the gaps between my big trapezoids. I also played around with 2 different pocket styles, this kind of kidney shaped one that I did in my previous cloak video, and then one other one coming up here in a second that's a double welt that, rather than being sewn into the seams, is sewn directly into the middle of a lining panel. And this is officially all of the pattern pieces that I drafted for this cloak. If you're wondering why I decided to draft this one digitally when I've normally just done these completely freehand, it's because I want to make sure you guys have access to a cloak pattern for anybody who doesn't really feel like doing the math themselves. I get these questions all the time on social media, so this pattern will be available as a free PDF to download. And now it's time for voiceover breaks. We're going to do a little montage here. Doing? Weirdo. Anyways, so to summarize our pattern pieces, for the body of the cloak, we have 5 full panels cut on the fold, then 2 panels cut off the fold with a seam allowance on the straight edge for both the velvet and the satin. Then we repeat that same system, 5 on the fold, 2 off, for the large overcloak and the small overcloak, both of which are optional. For the hood, this is 1/2 of a hood here. So we have 2 of that in velvet and 2 in satin lining. Then we also have the hood trim, which was cut on the fold for the short edge out of the velvet. There are 2 pocket types. I'm going with optional pocket B for this one. So I have pocket bags, 2 small ones and 2 large ones, then 4 of the double welt. If you're doing optional pocket A, you'll just have 4 of the same kidney shaped pocket out of your lining. And those are all of our pieces. To kick off the sewing for this cloak, we're going to be working on the outer layers of the main body panel first, which for me is my velvet. You can totally use any other fabric for this, like your satins and brocades and things like that. I just tend to gravitate towards velvet because I get a really cheap stretch velvet. Stretch is not necessarily ideal if you're working with a non-stretch lining, but you can interface the whole thing to make your life a little easier, which I know I should. I just really don't feel like using my fusible interfacing right now. It takes a while. So we're not gonna, and probably I'm gonna regret it in the future. But for now, It's fine. It's gonna go great. I've laid out all of my panels with the 5 full trapezoids cut on the fold in the middle, and then on either end of that I have my 2 half cut off the fold panels. The very outer edge should be straight when you're laying them out like this, because the half trapezoids have 1 diagonal edge and 1 straight edge. The diagonal edges need to be sewn together. The straight edge goes down the middle. For the most part, this section is going to be pretty straightforward. We'll be matching up the panels right sides together along their diagonal edges, pinning, sewing, and finishing those edges. But there is one pattern mark that we have to be aware of in advance if you want the optional armholes. On the diagonal edge of our pattern, 15.5 inches down from the very top edge, and then again 20.5 inches down, we have these 2 little T-shaped markers. These are your guide for the armholes. I recommend double checking the placement here to make sure it's a comfortable fit for you. To do this, you'll want to put your measuring tape where you want the neckline of your cloak to sit, and then follow that down your shoulder until like an inch or so above the bend of your elbow. For me, that is 15 on the dot. And then that second measurement, the 20, is just a few inches below your elbow so that you've got room to bend your arm. Once you're comfortable with the placement, mark the top and bottom of the openings on panels 2, 3, 5, and 6 so that you know when to stop and start sewing. From there, you'll match up all of your panels right sides together along the diagonal edge, pin, and sew. You know, I don't typically do a lot of those clips where I explain exactly what I'm doing before I actually do it, and now I don't really know what to do during this voiceover. So I guess we just, hang out for a second? Fun fact, I'm currently recording this voiceover from a cabin in rural Ireland. But now I kind of feel like this conversation is one-sided. Comment below where you're watching this from. Before we can repeat that whole process with the lining body panels, we need to sort out our pockets. If you like pocket option A, in one of these corners I will link the other video that I made with cloaks that goes into all the details about that, and you can just hop over there for a quick second to focus on that pocket, because in this cloak we are going to be doing the double welted pocket, which is scary, but we're gonna get through it. It's gonna be fine. I decided to sew my pockets into panels 2 and 6 of the main body of the cloak, but you can adjust that as is comfortable. I started out by marking the center line of the double welt, which is where the pocket will actually open, 24 inches down from the top of my panel. Once I had that line marked on the front side of panels 2 and 6, I flipped it over because we need to interface that back side as well as the 4 welts. I like fusible interfacing, but you could totally use sew-on if you prefer. I know some people get fancy and actually like to cut out their interfacing strips, but I'm lazy and prefer to do it in one fell swoop. Unfortunately, that was less of an option, trying to get it in just the right place for the pocket on the main panels. Once all the interfacing was done, I folded the welts in half and then pinned them one on either side of the line that we marked on the main cloak panels, with the folded edges facing away from each other, so the open part is facing each other and that central line. Next up, I took them to the sewing machine and sewed a straight line down the seam allowance along the entire long edge of each welt. Another fun fact, while we have a little extra time, I either majorly sprained or minorly broke my thumb on a rugby ball right before this. Once the linings were sewn on, I cut the slit that we originally marked on the panel, and then cut a little Y shape on either end of it, and tucked the 2 welts inside towards the wrong side of the fabric. To make sure it's nice and clean, I pressed it down on both sides, and then it was time to add the pocket bags. I pinned and sewed the large pocket bag to the top welt. I folded the large pocket bag up and out of the way, and then repeated that process with the small pocket bag and the lower welt. After another quick press, because the iron was already hot and we might as well keep things neat, I pinned the pocket bags together, starting at the top edge of the large pocket bag, and then working my way down that side, across the bottom, and up the other side. And that's the first pocket all done, which means we just have to do this all over again for the second one. With both pockets in, it's time to sew the lining together. I have my 5 full trapezoids, and then on either end there's the little half panels with the straight edges facing out and the diagonal edges being sewn together. Also, don't forget to add your armhole stop and start points between panels 2 and 3 and 5 and 6, otherwise you will not be able to actually access those armholes that we left in the velvet. Watching this over, I do wonder if maybe subconsciously I actually enjoy being stabbed repeatedly while trying to enjoy a basic hobby, because I did pin all of my panels together in one go, and then had to deal with all of those spiky tiny daggers while trying to sew the layers together. Consider making smarter choices than me. Or maybe don't. I don't know. Have fun with it. And at this point, the lining for the main panels is fully sewn together. This is what it looks like draped on, with that extra room for gathering around the neck, the armholes, and our pockets in place. And of course, without the pockets, we had the lining finished a little bit ago. And now we're going to make 2 tiny cloaks. Luckily, the overcloaks are literally just everything we've already done, except for adding the armholes and the pockets, so technically they're even easier, and they're on a smaller scale. So just repeat all of that again, sewing together all of your velvet panels on the diagonal edge, sewing together all of your lining panels on the diagonal edge, and then do it all one more time to get an even tinier cloak. Tiny cloaks would be significantly less time consuming, but pretty dang cute. This is what the lining looks like all sewn together, and the velvet is in a pile. Okay, so progress check. We have the lining for the main panel sewn, the velvet outer, and then lining and velvet for the 2 tiny cloaks, which means we're onto the hood now. The hoods are pretty straightforward. I started by matching up the right sides together, the left and right halves of the hood for both the velvet and the lining, and pinning all along that curved edge. And then naturally, after they were pinned, I sewed them together. Sometimes making these voiceovers is a little bit stressful because there's really only so many ways you can say pin and then sew, but it still needs to be said in order to provide detail and make sure y'all understand what the hell is happening, but I don't know, it's stressful. This is what the hoods look like now, and they've been serged because I'm fancy. Now it's time to add that little front bit so that we don't have an awkward seam right on the very edge of our face. Starting with the lining, I pinned the right sides together along the straight edge where your face hole is going to be. Is that the official term? I don't know. Face hole apparently is what we're going with for that though. Then, still working right sides together, I added the other edge of that long strip to the front edge of the velvet. And now the opening around the face is going to be in the middle of this extra strip rather than adjoining between 2 layers, which is a little bit classier. Okay, so now that all of our main panels are sewn together, we can start with a bit of assembly, then we'll do some decoration, and then finally we will put it all together. To kick off this assembly stage, I finished the raw edges between the panels and pressed the satin, then stacked my 2 overcloaks right sides together, and I'll eventually do the same for the main cloak over there, but the table is obviously not big enough for that. So we're going to pin and sew the curved lower hems on each of these layers. Dang it, I did it again. Now I have nothing to say to you because I already told you what I'm doing. Here goes another fun fact round, I guess. Did you know that the average reign of a British monarch is about 25 years? And that number is actually inflated by 2 particularly long reigning people. Book research is exciting. But that's officially all the time we have, folks, because we are moving on to the next section, which is horsehair. This stuff is pretty cool. It gives you stability in your hems and also a really pretty ripply shape. However, if you sew it in place as is, it will fall apart and stab you in lots of places. So, once I cut my horsehair to the right length, I added 2 little strips of satin to either end, just top stitching it on aggressively. And now these little scraps of satin will prevent the horsehair braid from falling apart. Accidentally off camera before this, I sewed all of the front edges, the straight edge on our trapezoids, by matching the lining and the velvet right sides together and just sewing straight down and then flipping it right side out again. So to place the horsehair, I sandwiched it between the 2 layers, getting it as close to the edge as I could so that it's pressed up against the inside seam allowance, and then flattened it out with pins. From there we have to do 2 rows of top stitching. The first one is about 1/4 of an inch up from the hem of the cloak, or in this case the overcloak. Then the next one after that is roughly 1.5 to 1.25 inch up to try to catch the top edge of the horsehair braid and keep that in place. Then while we're here, I figured I would connect the top edge of the cloak as well, since the horsehair was the last thing that we needed to do on the inside of the lining and outer materials. And this is what that looks like all finished up, which means we just have to repeat this for the second overcloak, and then almost the same thing for the hood, except instead of sandwiching against the seam, we're leaving a 1/2 inch gap or 1 seam allowance from the edge before our horsehair. But I hear you asking, what about the main body of the cloak, which we've completely abandoned for the last little bit? And you are correct, we did kind of stall out on that, but mainly because I forgot that I needed some kind of closure. The plan was to do ties, but I hadn't actually drafted a pattern for it, so it completely fell off my radar. And when you're doing things like ties, it does need to be done before you can connect the outer and the lining on that front edge, because otherwise it will be an awkward seam there rather than just being like tucked into the seam that's already there. So I quickly used some random scraps to make a vaguely tie-shaped thing, and ideally it would have been a little bit longer because the awkward length is unfortunate, but it's functional. And once that tie was sewn, pressed, and flipped right side out again, it was ready to be sewn into the cloak. I sandwiched the outer and the lining materials right sides together from the bottom to the top, and at the very top edge, about a half an inch down from the seam allowance, I added the tie. And once both sides of that front opening were sewn together and the whole thing was slipped right side out, we could add the horsehair the same way we did with the overcloaks. And now it's time to finish up the armholes. I laid the cloak out flat with the velvet on top, and then matched up the armholes just right between the two layers and started folding in half an inch of the velvet and half an inch of the lining so that we have a little sandwiched seam in there. This can get a little bit tight as you're pinning all of these, so try to avoid stabbing yourself as best as possible. And then when you get to the sewing machine, if you have the ability to remove a little component like this so you have a free arm, I highly recommend it. This becomes so much material to try to rotate as you're going around. But it does give you a nice clean armhole. This is the point where I briefly panicked about the length of that tie, but we're looking good so far. However, we could be looking epic if we add a bunch of shiny gold trim, so we're gonna make that happen. I tried to get even more shiny gold trim, but it was completely gone. The store had none left. It was a bummer. I'm certain that fancier people would have a fancier way of applying this, but I just pinned my trim where I wanted it and then top stitched in the least noticeable spot for a lot of trim. The last step before we add our hood is to connect the 3 layers of the cloak. I decided to gather each layer separately because I was pretty sure there was absolutely no chance I'd be able to gather them together without the thread just snapping 10 billion times. So I basted the top edge of the 2 overcloaks and the main cloak. And then I grabbed my measuring tape and did a bit of testing to see where I wanted the cloak to sit, and then measured that length to figure out how much I need to gather each of the different layers. Personally, I think that the collarbone is a pretty nice place to have it sit. Gathering every layer takes a little while though, so we're just gonna go ahead and skip, and now we're ready to connect them all. I started by pinning them at the very edges for each layer, and then just, worked my way around until the gathering was about even. Your machine might be a little bit mad at you for sewing through 3 layers of satin and 3 layers of velvet simultaneously, but it'll be okay. Or at least it had better be, because we're about to add another layer of both materials, because it's time to connect the hood. I basted the satin and the velvet on the hood separately, and then started by pinning the gathered satin on first to the wrong side of my cloak, or the lining side. And once that was sewn, I took the velvet layer and folded the seam allowance under so that I could top stitch. Not that you could really see any of that because the camera was pointed so badly. And finally, after days and days of sewing, this cloak is finally done, perfectly in time for it to get trashed on an escalator in Heathrow. Hopefully the Dawn I'm using after this works.
Just go for it. Well, that's really extra.
Now we need to take a moment to acknowledge this gorgeous outfit that my sister made and then graciously let me steal for the morning. Also, the Dawn worked on the velvet and not at all on the satin. I promise the last video in this Regency series will be a bit more Regency.